On Sunday mornings in Advent, we've been exploring questions that people have about Christmas. We've considered that Christmas, widely celebrated, that as time goes on in our post-Christian culture, this Christian report of Christmas is less believed. And as the report is less believed and as the celebration continues, then kind of foundational truths and meanings of the Christmas story are entering into the realm of myth. And I would suggest that the more mythical Christmas time becomes, the more depressing Christmas time will be. And I don't say that in an effort to be Scrooge-like. I'm trying to be an anti-Scrooge here. I'm working in the opposite direction, because what I don't want to have happen for you and what I'd prefer to not happen for the world in which I live is for the Christmases full of flashing lights to be absent the glory of the Lord. And I want to work in the opposite of that direction, because without the hope of the real birth of the real incarnate Son of God into a broken and dark world for the hope of the world, the minor themes that accompany the holidays will become more pronounced. The hope of Christmas is this, summarized in the ancient words of the Creed, that the Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and our salvation came down from heaven, and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary, and was made man, who for us men and our salvation. Because a Christmas time without those truths goes in this direction. Family gatherings provoke happy memories of members who are absent because of death or of illness without the hope of Christmas become more discouraging. Family gatherings that provoke sad memories because home was not the way that you would have wanted to have been growing up, in the realm of myth, become more disappointing. If gift giving feels more like a competition than a grace, then what you want is a secure identity rooted in a Savior, not in how well you'll be received by another person. If you're alone and wonder if you'll ever belong to a beloved, you want a more sure acceptance than what you can fabricate. And if you're an outsider and wonder if a community could ever accept you, a mythological Christmas won't help you. Which brings us to the report of the Magi and their visit to Bethlehem to identify and to worship Jesus, born King of the Jews. Matthew's report, from one perspective, sounds fantastic or even fictitious. If you're new to the story, the name Magi sounds mysterious, maybe a little bit like Jedi. Who were the Magi? Were they really guided to Bethlehem by a star? It sounds mythical. Did they really bring Jesus these gifts? Do the gifts matter? Do the kinds of gifts matter? Marco Polo, the 13th century explorer and inventor of swimming games, claimed it's as good as it gets this morning. He claimed to find the burial site of the Magi in a city in Persia called Saba. And he reports they are buried side by side in three very large and beautiful monuments. Above them is a square building carefully kept. The bodies are still entire with the hair and beard remaining. One of these was called Jasper, the second Melchior, and the third Belteshazzar. That's what he writes. They're buried in Saba. Or are they buried in a Nestorian church near Turkey? Or are their bones in the cathedral in Cologne, Germany, in a giant golden reliquary which you can visit today? And these contradicting traditions make the Magi sound mythical. And if you're skeptical about Christmas or about the story of Christmas, you might just say, see, sure, it's just all made up. They can't get the story straight. Why does Matthew include in his report of the real Christmas the story about the Magi? Do the Magi matter when I'm sad, when I'm insecure, when I feel like an outsider? Do they matter at all? The Magi state their mission in verse 2 when they arrive in Jerusalem. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. So they show up in the capital city of God's people looking for the King of God's people. And Matthew, who's begun his gospel showing us Jesus' genealogy, showing Jesus to be a royal descendant of David, showing him also to be a descendant of Abraham, the one through whom God promised to bless the world through an ever reigning descendant through Abraham, through David. Now the Magi show up and they say, we're looking for a king, maybe this king. And their visit is actually crucial to the story that Matthew wants us to consider. Matthew wants us, I think, to consider the rightness of recognizing Jesus as king, the folly of rejecting Jesus as king, and the necessity of receiving Jesus as king. So first, the rightness of recognizing Jesus as king. Magi were the religious leaders of the Persian world. They were a tribe of people who sought spiritual understanding using astronomy, astrology, dream interpretation. I saw someone describe them as kind of like New Age gurus, which I suppose works a little bit, except in their time and place, it was very serious work to be a magi. And so we shouldn't think of them as kind of strip plaza, palm-reading charlatans. They were pagan priests. It was serious work. And if you were at NPC this fall when we studied the first part of Daniel, you met Magi. 600 years before Jesus was born, Magi worked to interpret the dreams of the Babylonian kings. And Daniel, one of the Jewish captives in Babylon, with God's guidance, out-interpreted them. So Daniel, with God's guidance, out-interpreted the Magi, and on the night of the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the writing on the wall night, we learn that Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Daniel chief of the magicians, the mediums, the Chaldeans, the diviners, in other words, the Magi. And then after God delivered Daniel from the lion's den in Daniel 6, we learn that Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel had a long career working as the manager of the Magi. He was the chief of the Magi. And then in Daniel 7 to 12, chapter 7 to chapter 12, which we will look at after the turn of the year, Daniel has visions about future events. So surely Daniel, as manager of the Magi, would have made these visions known. I mean, it was his job to. He would have made these known to the teams of Magi's that they were leading, and they would have tried to understand the visions, and they would have searched for clues. And then as they were mentoring younger Magi, intern Magi, running around with clipboards, I imagine, learning from senior Magi, the senior Magi would have passed on the visions to the younger Magi. And so for at least 600 years, they would have been trying to sort this out. For 600 years, Magi lived alongside Jewish people in Babylon. They learned what Jewish people believed, so they would have known about God's work. They would have known the Old Testament. They would have known God's promise to Abraham to have a descendant through whom the nations would be blessed. They would have known of God's promise to David that Israel would have a forever king. These aren't small points in the story. These are major points in the Old Testament. And it's not for sure that the Bethlehem Magi were from Babylon or from Persia or from Iraq or Iran or Saudi Arabia. They're from the east, but they would have been part of this culture. And when they arrive, they bring gifts showing that they recognize God's king. Not only because their gifts are fit for royalty, but because their gifts are perfectly informed by the kind of king that Daniel and the people of God were waiting for. Now, gold is an obvious gift. If you are one of those who loves the adrenaline rush of delaying your Christmas shopping, and it's Christmas Eve and you find yourself in Walgreens, and it's between the leftover candy canes or going to a jeweler, gold's appropriate. But it's not just that gold is appropriate for a king. God, through Isaiah, hundreds of years before Jesus was born, said that when his glory returned to Israel, the nations would celebrate with caravans of gold. This is what he says through Isaiah: a multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba, which is from the east, from where the Magi came, shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and each shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. And the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you, the rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. So a caravan of gold and frankincense from the east, brought to Israel when the glory of the Lord returns to Israel. And how much more completely could the glory of the Lord return to Israel than in his own incarnate person? It's the maximum amount of glory possible to return to Israel. And here comes the caravan. Frankincense was used in Old Testament worship. The association of incense with worship created an association with God's holy name. Through Malachi, God said, "For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name shall be great among the nations. And in every place incense will be offered to my name, and a pure offering, for my name will be great among the nations, now says the Lord of hosts." And here come the Magi from the nations, from the east, a caravan of gold and of incense. It's almost like they had their packing list ready. Gold? Check. Incense? Check. The nations bearing treasure to God's people because God has returned to his people. A king for God's people, a king for God's people from every part of the world. So the visit of the Magi is, in the first place, good news if you are an outsider. If you are an outsider, if you feel outside to the purposes of God, if you feel outside to the people of God, if you wonder if there can be a place for you among the people of God, the visit of the Magi is a resounding yes to that. Because God sends outsiders to worship the king. And from another perspective, while it has been their job to wait for the king and to search for the king and to study for the king for 6 centuries, there is another perspective for which these are not likely characters to show up to worship because they're pagan priests. The visit of the Magi tells us that when the glory of the Lord comes, the invitation is to all to recognize him and to worship him. So that's good news to you if you wonder if you belong, if you are welcome. The Magi say yes. If we're welcome, you're welcome. But secondly, the story shows us the folly of rejecting Jesus as king. So parents love to tell their kids stories of their births, I think. At least we did on our kids' birthdays. We didn't tell them all the stories. We just told them some of the stories. But we would tell John how he was born in a Dakota ice storm that iced the medical staff into the hospital. We were super thrilled to have a baby. They were less thrilled to be there for a day. But they got paid. It's all right. Luke was born a couple of weeks after 9/11. And we worried as young parents with a military connection if I'd be there for his birth. We tell him that story. Annika was born super fast, which I think explains why she now likes to sleep in. She's like, I showed up on time for the important thing. I know she's listening to this in Detroit. It's all right. We'll talk about it later. My point is simply this. Set your alarm clock. No, my point is simply this. Could Joseph and Mary have been much different? As they retold Jesus the story of his birth, like think about it, like Jesus' 5th birthday. How could they not tell him the story of his birth? There was shepherds and angels, and these Magi came, and they brought you these gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. I wonder, as they told Jesus, teenage Jesus, young adult Jesus, I wonder if he reflected on the wise men who came to identify him as Messiah. I wonder what the aroma of myrrh would have meant to Jesus. Have you smelled myrrh? It's very distinctive. Myrrh would have been, at one level, an aroma of recognition for Jesus. At another level, it would have been an aroma of rejection of Jesus. Let me explain. The Magi introduce us to the folly of rejecting Jesus as king. Herod and the theologians of Jerusalem illustrate that folly. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod the Great, there are a couple of different Herods in the New Testament. This is Herod the Great, and he was a puppet king who was installed by the Roman emperor. He was not a descendant of David. He was not Jewish. So he was the not Jewish king of the Jewish people, and he was paranoid. He was paranoid, and he was obsessed with managing his legacy. He was so obsessed with managing his legacy that he had one of his sons killed, and kind of manipulated his will so that when he died, all of the leaders of Israel were to be rounded up and executed, so that the people of Israel would be sad, because they weren't going to be sad that he was dead. So he was going to give them something to cry about. Now, that didn't actually happen. They didn't enact that part of his will because he was dead. And he was not a good dude. So when the Magi ask, "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him," this pushes all of Herod's buttons. A king of the Jews would be more legitimate, is a huge threat to his agenda. And so he is going to reject Jesus as king, and his rejection is rooted really in self-promotion. And the people of Jerusalem are alarmed. I don't think that they share Herod's concern because they're not on Herod's side. They don't really care if Herod gets replaced. They're not alarmed at a threat to Herod's rule, but they know what kind of leader Herod is. And so they would have anticipated bad things from Herod. Herod is not going to go easy. They would have anticipated the kind of power-preserving homicide that Herod instigated on the young boys in Bethlehem, which you can read about in the second half of the chapter. So the population is going to reject the arrival of the king, really rooted in self-preservation. We don't want the boat to be rocked. But for me, rereading the story this year, most haunting is the apathy of the religious leadership. Assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judah, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. 100%. Excellent job, theologians. Don't you imagine, armed and informed by their Bibles and alerted by the Magi, that they'd make the trek to Bethlehem? Do you know how far away Bethlehem is from Jerusalem? 6 miles. A healthy adult person could walk it in 2 or at most 3 hours. A lot of you drove further to come to this church service this morning. And they don't go. Why don't they? I mean, the theologians from Persia came. Why don't they go? Why the apathy? Well, Matthew is going to spend the whole rest of his gospel filling in this blank. The apathy transitions to rejection, and rejection puts into motion the redemption by the king. Mark, the gospel writer, tells the story this way, and he shows us how myrrh, which had been an aroma of recognition by the Magi, becomes part of the aroma of the rejection of God's people, of the king. In Mark's gospel, they compel the passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they placed Jesus, and they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Wine and myrrh mixed together were a basic anesthetic. We can't know. We could only speculate. What memories the aroma of myrrh stimulated in the mind of the Messiah as he hung on the cross. I wonder if he remembered his birthday gifts from the Magi. I wondered if he remembered how theologians from Persia had come to recognize him as king, even as the theologians of his own people had rejected him. He was not caught by surprise. We know in many places in the Gospels this report, as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the 3rd day." Part of why we are introduced to Herod and the population of Jerusalem and the theologians of Jerusalem is Matthew is setting the stage for us to see the folly of the rejection of Jesus and to show us different ways that people decide to reject Jesus. One is the folly of self-promotion. We don't have to be a megalomaniac like Herod. I hope that you're not a Herod-level megalomaniac. But we all love to be the heroes of our story. And when Jesus shows up and he challenges us to make him the hero of our story, well, that can be a real challenge if we've built our life around ourselves. And we all know what it is like to be like the population of Jerusalem. We understand self-preservation. We understand not wanting Jesus to show up in our life and to have our boat rocked. We understand what it is like to not want Jesus to show up and make things challenging, to push us out of our comfort area. And we might know what it's like to be apathetic. We might know what it's like to know all the Bible answers. and to have none of the faith. To know everything that there is to know that's been written down about Jesus, but not be willing to take the trip to see if he actually came. Here's the good news, that Jesus, the one in the manger, embraced the rejection in order to free us from the emptiness of self-promotion. Because if you trace out the story of the Herods, it's over by the end of the book of Acts. No more Herods. 2 generations. That's what self-preservation got Herod. 2 generations. That's what self-preservation gets us if we try to be the master of our own destinies. What about the hopelessness of the people of Jerusalem who didn't want their boat rocked? 70 years later, after Jesus is born, Jerusalem is wiped out. The Romans come in and they take it apart stone for stone. That plan didn't work out. What about the apathy of the theologians? That didn't work out. But Jesus came and he endured the rejection of Herod. He endured the rejection of the population. He endured the rejection of the theologians so that we wouldn't have to. So that we can come and we can be accepted. Don't fall for the folly of rejecting Jesus as king. Instead, learn from the Magi, the rightness of receiving Jesus as king. The non-foolish response of the Magi, I think, is intended to be our guide. When the Magi meet Jesus, look at verse 10. When the Magi meet Jesus, they weren't just a little happy. These are not like my German family ancestors, where we keep all of our happy feelings on the inside. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. There aren't more Greek words available to Matthew for him to write down to describe how happy they were. So he just piles them up. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and they worshiped him. It's not even in my notes, but I just wonder, they'd been aiming at this moment for 600 years. And their dads and their granddads and their great-granddads and their books had told them that this was coming. And now they're there. And they get to meet the king. And if they remember their Daniel correctly, they're meeting the little stone. Do you remember that from the Daniel story? Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of the statue, and it's made of the different metals, and it's gold, and then it gets kind of decreasingly valuable, and then finally, Nebuchadnezzar sees a little stone that comes and knocks down all the kingdoms. And it's not confusing them what it is. They're like, this one is going to come who's going to knock down all the kingdoms of the world. They weren't uninformed about what this baby was going to do. This is the little stone baby who's going to thwart and overthrow and knock down all of the kingdoms of the world. Herod, not worried about him. Rome, not worried about them. This is the guy that we've been waiting for. The writer of the New Testament book that we call Hebrews describes faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And we see that in the Magi's response. They'd had this hope informed by Daniel. God had guided them there by a star. There was a king they hoped to meet. And they see a baby, and they see all that a baby is. We've got Baby Corner in the back of the church. I was visiting Baby Corner before church. And if you have been a while since you talked to a baby, you can go visit a baby. It's a service that we provide here at NPC. Or Elizabeth would like you to work with some babies. Babies are pretty small. They're pretty dependent. They're pretty helpless. And they come and they see this small, dependent, helpless baby in this home that's modest at best. No palace, no miracles, no angel choirs, and they believe. Because God had said, and God had led, and they believe. J.C. Ryle, the British pastor, says that their faith here at the beginning of Jesus' ministry is as great as the thief on the cross at the end of Jesus' ministry. Remember that guy? He didn't know much about Jesus either. He just believed. They just believe. Is their belief well placed? Let me ask that question if you're skeptical. Is their belief well placed? Are they right to receive Jesus as king? Are they making the right decision? Well, myrrh helps us. The aroma of acceptance, which had become the aroma of rejection, becomes the aroma of victory. In John 19 and 20, let me remind you of the story. Jesus is, at this point in the story, dead. Nicodemus, also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloe, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloth with the spices, the 75 pounds of spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there with the 75 pounds of myrrh. Myrrh to mask the smell of decay. And now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw the stone that had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to him, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him." So Jesus' resurrection is resurrection to new physical life after real physical death. Physical life with all of its tangible, sensible properties. So I want you to picture this if you've never pictured this. There is a moment in history where dead Jesus becomes alive Jesus. And in the being alive, what are some things that would have happened? Well, his heart would have started beating, and his lungs would have started breathing. And as his heart started beating and his lungs would have started breathing, his nose would have started smelling, right? So what is the first thing that Jesus is going to smell when he goes, "Oh, I'm alive"? He's going to smell myrrh. And it's not like he forgot, but it's all going to come full circle. The wise men and the recognition and the people and the rejection and now the resurrection and the victory, which reminds us and teaches us that the faith of the Magi is well placed. It's not just that they want Jesus to be king. It's that Jesus is actually king. It's not just that they want to worship him. It's that he compels our worship. Because he came, and he lived, and he died, and he's risen. And because he's risen, it's right to receive him. So this is my simple invitation for you as we come to the Lord's table this morning. Where are you at? Have you worshiped the King? Is there something that's in the way of worshiping the King? Is there something that you need to lay down so that you can worship the King? Are you like the people of Jerusalem? Are you like the theologians? Do you need to overcome your apathy to the King? Or are you like the Magi? Are you worshiping the King who is? Because he's alive.